So you've read the title, What is the Middle Ages? And yes, this is a boring one. Yeah! So what is the Middle Ages? Well, that is the question I want to ask for this first video because there might be people that are generally wondering what is the Middle Ages, right? And don't want just the basic definition that you can find in a dictionary and then want something a bit more thought. The second reason why is because people think that a lot of things in history, historical terms and concepts are set in stone and they can never change. But that is not the case. History is always debated by historians, and so we need to engage a bit more critically with concepts in history, and that's why I'm making this video. What is the medieval period is a big question, and I'm just gonna have two sub-questions to sort of help me answer that question. And it's gonna be, when did it begin and when did it end? For this video, I picked two main books that I'm going to talk about a lot. I obviously have other resources too, and all of it is going to be available in the description below in my bibliography, and you're more than welcome to have further readings, but also sort of correct me if I'm wrong, fact check me. The two books that I picked are Marcus Bow's Thinking Medieval, An Introduction to the Study of the Middle Ages, and a book I actually have a physical copy of, which is Jacques Le Goff's À la Recherche du Moyen Âge, translation of which is My Quest for the Middle Ages. And this book, from the title and the author name, you've guessed it, this is a French medievalist. Jacques Le Goff is really one of those household names and in French medieval historiography, because I'm talking to an English-speaking audience and who are probably living in an English-speaking country. I thought it would be interesting for you guys to sort of introduce you to other countries' historiography to kind of broaden up the vision, the horizon. And Le Goff, in his book, has a really good analysis. That's why I picked it. And he has some controversial takes towards the end of it. And that's why I thought it would be interesting to pick this one. And for Marcus Bow, he is not as well known as Le Goff. He is still a good English medievalist. And his book had a lot of positive reviews. And I really like some of his analysis. And the conclusion is different to Le Goff, so that's why I picked him. You're going to be probably familiar with this timeline of history, right? Really basic: prehistory, antiquity, Middle Ages, Renaissance, modern, and contemporary. You can sort of kind of pinpoint what happens in each period. And quite fittingly, the Middle Ages is right in the middle. Now, without going forwards with the video, I would just like you guys to think about what are the cutoff points for the Middle Ages. What is the beginning century and ending century, and even the years, if you remember it. And I would like also you guys to ask other people about it if you can. And you'll see that the answers might be different than yours. And there's also a possibility that they might be different because the other person you're talking with was either born in a different country or is from an older generation. A lot of people are going to say the Middle Ages happened between the 5th and 15th century. And if you've got specific years, you might even say it began in 476 and ended in 1492. But some other people might say, well, it actually began in 496 and ended in 1453. So this is going to start and get a little bit more interesting because these dates are all subjective and arbitrary. And here's why. Le Goff and Bow have given multiple dates in each of their books of possible beginnings and ends for the Middle Ages. And here's a table where I list all of them. That's a massive list. And all of them have valid justifications, but also valid weaknesses. So let's pick the 2 dates that are used more commonly in English-speaking countries, which are 476 and 1492. What happened in those 2 years? The first one is the end of the Western Roman Empire, and the second one is Columbus reaching America. Valid, right? They're very important events. I mean, the end of the Roman Empire that lasted for centuries, that makes a lot of sense. That's, something new must happen afterwards. And Columbus reaching America kickstarted colonialism in the Americas. So that makes a lot of sense. Until you poke some holes into it and you realize that it's not that easy. So let's start off with 476. To set the historical context a bit, you have to remember that the Roman Empire was cut in 2 pieces. You had the Eastern Roman Empire with Constantinople as its capital and the Emperor Zeno. And on the other side, you had the Western Roman Empire with the capital in Rome. To say it really quickly, the Western Roman Empire was in shambles, right? The Eastern Roman Empire, doing great. They're probably the most dominant force in the Mediterranean, the richest empire of the 2, and had, political stability. Everything went well. The Western Roman Empire, on the other hand, was not having a good time. As you could see in the table that I showed previously of the possible beginning and end of the Middle Age, you could see that there's already twice moments where Rome was sacked. There's actually even a third time 4 years prior to 476. So you can already see that it wasn't very stable. Who was the emperor in 476? The emperor of the Western Roman Empire was a guy called Romulus Augustulus. He is 15 years old. He didn't have much power. And really, locally, at least, the power was with the guy who eventually took him out. And that guy's name is Odoacer. So you can start and see that, argument forming of, was there really a Western Roman Empire by 476? Didn't it already sort of end 4 years prior or even 50 years prior? And some people might have a response to that saying, well, at least it's very symbolic, right? The end of the Roman/Latin influence in the Mediterranean was signaled by Romulus Augustulus being thrown out. And, that sort of makes sense. But then again, there's some sort of continuity because Odoacer, first name Flavius, right? Flavius, even though he's the Germanic guy, right? Still has a Roman name, probably had a sort of Latin education. In that sense, there's some sort of continuity. And he was directly acknowledged by Zeno, the Eastern Roman Empire guy. So once again, is there really the end of the Latin influence? But then also this idea of, a strong Latin center in Rome at that time is not true because the Roman Empire, especially towards the later stages, was highly Hellenicized, so had a lot of Greek influence. Now for 1492, again, Columbus, when he reached America and came back, he thought he went to Asia, first of all, and secondly, it was not as world-changing event at the time. It was not perceived as such. And it's only because we have hindsight that we can attribute such an importance to this date. So it's sort of flimsy. But also, if you think about it, right? The guy there, in 1492, on the eve of 1493, he was like, that's it. 1493, I guess we're in a different historical period now. No. Right? That does not make any sense. We attributed these labels to these periods and we attributed specific years to these periods. And why is that the case? It's because of the demands of schooling. Unlike what you might think, schools are here not for learning, but to make kids memorize things and to rank them, essentially, to prepare them for the workforce. That's why you learn about your multiplication tables. You have to memorize them. You have to memorize the beginning and end of the Middle Ages, so 476, 1492. And if you try and argue and say, hey, but, Le Goff said, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong, because on the test, if you try and argue and say, well, I actually learned this, that's not right. You have to say what you memorized. I'm getting off a bit on a tangent here about my critique of, modern schooling. But the idea is, it's made there for you to memorize, to put in your brain. It's like when you learn about the different, stages of matter, right? You learn that, things are liquid, gas, or solid. But there's actually, a fourth one, which, thanks to modern schooling, I don't even remember right now. What was it again? Plasma? Anyways, there's a fourth state, right? And you never learn it because they tell you there's 3 of them. And they're like, list 3, and you can't put a fourth one in. Going back to what I said earlier about how where you were born and when determines partially what your answer is to the question of when did the medieval period begin and end, I can give you the example of France. So, if you ask a French person of my age, they might say, well, it began in 476, so the same as the previous answer, and it ended in 1453. And that's because in France, we're so anti-American that we don't even like to acknowledge that, Columbus had any impact, and decided that 1453, the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, is a signifier of the end of the Middle Ages. If you ask a person from a older generation, they might actually give you a different answer for the beginning period, which is going to be 496. So what happened in 496 to be that important, and why older people are saying that's the beginning? At the end of the 19th century, when the Third Republic was established in France, there was really a demand for institutions that guaranteed the stability of the Republic. Because you had a First and Second Republic that were both foiled by people like emperors and kings. So they say, okay, we have to make proper institutions that instill republican and patriotic values to kids, essentially. And so for history classes, they have this thing called le roman national, or the national novel, in which, it tells a romanticized and patriotic history of France with protagonists such as Joan of Arc or the French revolutionaries that, protected France from the foreign invasions. And in that, idea of a national novel, we have the beginning of the Middle Ages set in 496, because that is the year where Clovis, the king of the Franks, so the Franks were Germanic people that eventually moved into what is now the geographic location of France. Clovis was baptized in 496 as the first king of the Franks. And that is a major event because we have finally a king of the place when we live in, we are descendants of. And so, because that's such an important event, they decided that's the beginning of the Middle Ages. 476, 492, 1453, 1492, whatever, all of these dates are subjective, arbitrary, and corresponds to the need of schooling, either to form, an intelligent workforce or to make good patriots. I can pick any dates really and say they're valid. Like I could probably say, it began in 410 and it ended in 1527. Both of them are sacks of Rome by different people, but, I could argue that because all roads lead to Rome, the road of the beginning and end of the medieval periods is between Rome. So, right? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And we should not restrict ourselves to these rigid years. To give you a bit more perspective on why we shouldn't have rigid dates, one example that is super easy, right? The World War II. When did it begin and end? 1939, 1945, right? That's solid. You can't do anything about it. Unless again, you have a different perspective, right? If you look at a perspective from the Czech Republic, the Germans annexed the Sudetenland in 1938, so a year before. That can be an act of aggression and the beginning of World War II, if you wanted. You can look at it from the Chinese perspective and say it's actually 1937 because that's the second Sino-Japanese war that kick-started the World War II in that area and eventually led to Japan bombing Pearl Harbor and everything. That also has a valid argumentation. If I want to be even more annoying, I'm going to say, well, actually, it's Mussolini when he invaded Ethiopia in 1935. It started an international crisis and World War II happened later on. Makes sense as well, to a certain degree. I can try and argue for it. We should not try and put rigid, specific dates on the Middle Ages. So instead, maybe we should oppose time periods to each other in order to see what they are. The way things were happening in antiquity did not happen in the Middle Ages. Antiquity is its own time period, and it makes sense. The Middle Ages is its own time period, and it makes sense. What comes after the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, has its own... So let's rewind the clock a little bit. Where and when did the term Middle Ages appear? So there's a lot of traces of people using Middle Age or Middle Ages to talk about a specific period in time throughout history, but really the term as we know it nowadays comes from the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers are people like Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Adam Smith, Kant, these type of people. They thought that there was a golden age in humanity, and that golden age was during the classic Greek and Roman times. That golden period ended, and Europe was plunged in a dark age, which is the Middle Ages. That's why both of them are now synonyms, the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. And then from that Dark Age comes the Enlightenment. And so these people thought, because now we're thinking more about concepts like individuality and ethics and morals and logic, these type of things, we have come out of this Dark Age into Enlightenment, and these Enlightenment thinkers sought to recapture some of the elements from that golden period before in the classic Greek and Roman times. And the Enlightenment thinkers blame this Dark Ages on despotic kings, but also on the Catholic Church, because we do all know that Enlightenment thinkers are not really fond of the Catholic Church. This myth of the Dark Ages and the Middle Age, that's in between the Golden Period and the Enlightenment, is really a product of the Enlightenment. They describe that themselves. And you can really see it in their books. So I'll take an example from Voltaire. His book, Essai on Universal History, the Manners and Spirits of Nation, written in 1756, denigrates the Middle Ages. So according to him, the Middle Ages were a time of confusion, tyranny, barbary, and poverty. He finds no evidence of superior morals neither in France, nor England, nor in Germany, nor the northern countries, as barbary, superstition, ignorance covered the face of the world. And obviously this is because the papal power always enslaved all the other powers. It is only towards the end of the 13th and into the beginning of the 14th century that we start to come out of this grossness whose rust had covered Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. So yeah, Voltaire did not really like the Middle Ages, and he certainly did not like what the Catholic Church did. In the 19th century, when the profession of historian became more professionalized and there were more historical methods being developed in order to analyze history, you had a new creation, which was something that backed up the sentiment of the Enlightenment thinkers, and that creation was the Renaissance, with a big R, capital R. Now, if you go back to that timeline of history, you can see that the Renaissance happens right after the Middle Ages, and it's between the 15th and 16th century. Traditionally, we are taught that the Renaissance happened because of two things. First of all, 1453, Constantinople gets taken, and there is a fleeing west of many Greek scholars and artists. And they end up in northern Italy, which, condition number two, had an immense economic boom because of its commerce in the Mediterranean. And so you had lots of rich and wealthy patrons that were able to essentially fund these creative and intellectual endeavors. Also, these artists and intellectuals were living literally where the Roman Empire was, and so they had a lot of access to classic Roman art and texts. That created, first of all, the humanist movement, which was an intellectual movement that put, the study of human nature at the center of his thinking. And this spread out throughout Europe, and you have different writers and intellectuals such as Erasmus or Rabelais. And then you've got new artistic movements with artwork whose quality was not seen in the Middle Ages. And you have people like Michelangelo or Botticelli, or even the famous
Da Vinci?
And again, traditionally, the Renaissance was seen as a time where these ancient, or actually classic Roman and Greek arts and texts were rediscovered. And so it brought on, the emergence of the Middle Ages, that Dark Ages, into something with a bit more light into it. And that started in northern Italy and spread towards the north, where you had the Northern Renaissance later on. Ah, the Renaissance. Amazing, right? But what if I told you that there are multiple Renaissances during the Middle Ages if we just consider that factor of, intellectual and artistic movements generated and inspired from classic Rome and Greece? I'm going to name you just two of them, for starters. The first one is the Carolingian Renaissance, which happened between the 8th and 9th century. And it was under the impulse of Emperor Charlemagne, who was inspired by the Roman Empire. That's why he came up with him being the emperor and created his own empire. And under his impulse, there was a lot of research going into the true Bible, and there was also a script reform, the Carolingian, right? And all of this in order to garner more power as this new emperor. You also have the emergence of Carolingian art, which was, again, heavily inspired by Roman architecture and art. Then you've got the 12th century Renaissance, where, amongst a lot of things, you have, for example, the emergence of medieval universities, and these are new because beforehand, any centers for learning or producing knowledge was always attached to a church or a monastery. Medieval universities had independence in that sense, and any topics ranging from philosophy, theology, and science were taught and built upon in these universities. And obviously, they had to look at ancient Roman, Greek, and sometimes even Arabic sources in order to generate that knowledge. So as you can see, the rediscovery of classic texts was not new. Actually, novelty in the Middle Ages was seen really negatively, and Goff even says in his book that if you took Thomas of Aquinas, again, another important person in the medieval Renaissance, if you want to call it that, if you took him aside and said to him, well, I really loved what you did with Aristotle's work in your work, and that was, novel and unseen, amazing, he would probably be scandalized. Because medieval artists and scholars, they use the authority that these texts and art have of being done in the past, and they take those ideas, and they recontextualize them to fit a medieval context. That's all they did with them. They did not think anything new or to be special or anything. It's just because these are old things. They have some truth in it. Obviously, for example, for the academic writings or theological writings, these pagans like Plato or Aristotle, obviously they're going to have some wrong things, but they also say some right things. So that's why they would reuse, not rediscover. So let's go back to those 19th century historians that invented this Renaissance with a capital R that is different from the Middle Ages. I have to introduce you to this guy, Beuchot. He is a Swiss-German art historian and he's passionate about 15th century Italy and its art. His book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, which was published in 1860, talks again about this Europe plunged into darkness, underdeveloped, but northern Italy was a little bit more developed than other countries and took the lead. This is where the idea that the Italian Renaissance was so important can be explained by historical and political context of the 19th century. Germany in the 19th century was in pieces. You had multiple kingdoms and principalities, independent cities, things like that. It was not one unified country, it was in pieces. There was a rise in the German nationalist vision of unifying all German speakers under one country. And so these German historians, or German-speaking historians, looking at that and looking back at past countries that were completely divided, such as Italy in the 15th century, which was again the same. It was a bunch of city-states and kingdoms, all separate and not unified. And somehow they created this amazing art, an amazing intellectual production, and also had a good economy. So why can't 19th century Germany, divided as it is, also not be successful as 15th, 16th century Italy? And so we have this sort of like bringing Germany down to the south, down to Italy. And there's a lot of German historians from that period, especially the Rankian school, who was influential in developing a lot of things for historiography and the historical method. But they also were advocates of the Renaissance being separate. They really liked also the Northern Renaissance idea of how, the humanist ideals went up to the north with Erasmus, for example, but also how that led eventually to the Protestant schism that initiated in German-speaking countries and how that broke off from the Middle Ages. This idea of the Renaissance being that important was heavily influenced by the Germans and their ideals of the Volksgeist, this nascent German nationalism. But again, they were not the only ones to really like the Renaissance. If you look at, for example, France, once again, the biggest historian there at the time was Jules Michelet, and in his book History of France, he basically, talks about the medieval times, but essentially he says there's nothing really valuable to gain from it. It's only afterwards that's more important. And Goff talks about the medievalists from that time period really thinking medieval Europe as like the childhood state of Europe, right? And that it matures when it hits the Renaissance. So after having this context into why we have the Middle Ages being the Dark Ages and why the Renaissance is put on a pedestal because of the Enlightenment thinkers' anti-clericalism, but also 19th century historians not taking seriously the Middle Ages and having political agendas for some, it makes sense that there is some skepticism of the Renaissance, 15th, 16th century being such a, time-changing period that has to be classified differently from the Middle Ages. And it can't just integrate the Middle Ages. And there's going to be a lot of Renaissance studies students or even professors watching this. Don't get mad at me, but that's the thing. That's the historical context behind these terms. And I have more problems with the Renaissance. First of all, we are talking about a very small group of people. Again, these elites that were wealthy and were patrons to the intellectual thinkers and artists, they were the ones that enjoyed most of this production, the production of the Renaissance, culturally and intellectually. Like, unless the art was displayed in the church, for example, you had to commission a painting. And for the books, well, it was really expensive to buy a book at the time. And we're talking about a very restricted geographical location, which is northern Italy, and to some extent, like northern France, some of Germany, and the Netherlands and things like that. But again, it's a very small portion of Europe. And can you really say that something that affects only those regions should be part of European history? Also, the Renaissance being a break-off point from the Middle Ages wouldn't make really sense because it has its roots in the Middle Ages. There's a lot of thinkers that predate the Renaissance that, were very influential. And really, can we, separate, for example, people like Dante and Boccaccio and Chaucer from the Renaissance that happened afterwards? Didn't their works also influence writers in the next generation? Because these people lived a century before the 15th century. For the arts, we can talk about Giotto, the painter, right, or the architect Pisano. And again, Pisano, he was very influenced by Roman architecture. So again, this idea of it being so different because people rediscovered the classic Romans and Greeks, no, there's some sort of continuity. So this really makes sense to break it off right there. Going back to this idea that the Renaissance affected only a minority of people, you can even half that amount of people in two. Because, women were not really included in this. Because, and somehow, also I forgot to say earlier that 19th century historiography somehow paints the Renaissance as a time for progress for women, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, even Beuchot himself wrote it in an 1860 book, and there's this groundbreaking text by Joan Kelly, and she writes, she asks the question, did women have a Renaissance? And the answer is sort of no. She argues that the Renaissance is a very male-centered movement, right? Because most of the things that were produced at the time were made by men for an audience of men. And, and the ideas that she had in them were very misogynistic, obviously, because of that, repurposing of ancient Roman and Greek texts, who were massive misogynists, obviously, at the time. You had the same coming back. And, there's this idea of the social divisions of gender and more promotion of those ideas. And one direct effect, for example, is noble women having less power because of the division in society of gender, but also because there's like this abandonment, for example, of the idea of courtly love. And so you have more arranged marriages because we consider less women. And these texts, again, they emphasize the subordination of women in front of men. So, can you really say that this is such a progressive and changing moment for history when that happened? So again, I might piss people off because they're doing, Renaissance studies or are really, into the Renaissance for some reason. But I propose that we claim the 15th and 16th century to the Middle Ages. And I can see you guys from the modern period saying, hey, that's ours, but I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to lose to a modern period enthusiast. So for me, like a lot of historians, Did I call myself a historian? I haven't even graduated. Anyways, but for people that think about history, we do not think of history being like the historical timeline like this. It's not parceled off into smaller pieces. That's just for us to sort of know where we're at. And Le Goff really, he's into this idea of a long Middle Ages, as if, 1,000 years wasn't enough. He thinks of history in terms of a long, continuous line that, curves around. They are not breaking points, but turning points, not cutoff points. And Le Goff wrote another book after this one, which was Faut-Il Vraiment Découper l'histoire en tranches, which roughly translates to, should we really cut up history into pieces? And he goes even to argue that the Middle Ages basically last until the 18th century, which is really wild. And that's why, I agree with the man, because, he's got the brains, but 18th century, that's a bit too far. But I mean, that's a valid argument, I guess. He argues that, sure, Columbus's trip to America started a new age of cross-continental travel and European colonialism, but it's only from the 18th century where this process was largely developed. He also argues that the rural economy, which was so typical of the Middle Ages, largely stayed into the 16th century and beyond. He also says that the use of wooden tools lasted until the 18th century, when the beginning of the mechanization and industry required increasing use of metal tools. Even if we look at cultural habits, Le Goff argues that people in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and a bit beyond, they had the same habits, right? They had a very plant-based diet because of that agricultural, rural economy. They also drank the same things, which was beer, liqueurs, and those more higher alcoholic beverages. They were only drank from the 18th century onwards. Also, is Shakespeare not a medieval author, right? Why is he something else? Le Goff shares Helen Cooper's analysis about Shakespeare being a medieval author, because there's a lot of continuity in his themes compared to his predecessors, like Chaucer, for example, or the medieval narratives of the Chanson de Geste. Even his characters are kings and queens, shepherds and jesters, and they follow a lot of these medieval tropes. So Le Goff puts the end of the Middle Ages, for all of those reasons and more, in the 18th century. Because he argues that the inventions of the late 17th, early 18th completely changed Europe, and that justifies a new time period. So in 1687, Denis Papin invents or thinks about the steam engine, and it was made possible by James Watt in 1769, and that allowed the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England. He also talks about the rational scientific thinking and the progressive abandonment of the Catholic faith because of the Enlightenment thinkers' anti-clericalism. He cites examples such as the dictionary by d'Alembert and Diderot, and how that universalizes knowledge. And finally, he talks about how this period signified the beginning of the end of monarchies with the French Revolution. Marcus Bull, on the other hand, argues that maybe one day we would simply abandon the term Middle Ages, because after all, it is an old terminology that dates back to the 18th and 19th century. But according to him, there's still a need to sort of cut off history into bits, because human history is so long that we have to sort of navigate through it, and putting labels on things can be helpful. And also talks about how it's useful for schooling. And he also says that in the end, a lot of researchers and academics, they say they are specialists of a specific century. So they're going to be like, yeah, I'm a specialist of France in the 10th century, or things like that. Now, hear me out. Neither Le Goff or Marcus Bull have the definitive answer of when does the Middle Ages begin and when does it end, and what comes after and what comes before. They don't have the definitive answer. I don't have the definitive answer because as historians, we debate on things and we try to settle on a common ground. And it seems that the common ground among these two historians and other ones that subscribe to them is that the Renaissance cannot be a period that's apart, and also that you cannot put rigid dates on the Middle Ages. That's just the thing. Whether it be a series of turning points that is in the end a continuation, or whether we should amend the term altogether. My personal answer would be that yes, there is a thing that we should call the Middle Ages, for lack of better terms, really, and people have an idea of what the Middle Ages is just by the name. So to remove it and replace it by something else would be not really useful in the present, I would feel. And I would not go as far as Le Goff says, and saying the Middle Ages lasted until the 18th century, unless I want to own modernists, because maybe from what you will see, I don't really like modern history. So yeah, I would say 16th century would be sort of when the Middle Ages changes into something else. And yeah, that's my personal opinion. But again, my personal opinion, or even Le Goff's, household name of French historiography, his opinion is not the absolute truth. The last thing I want to say is that this entire conversation about the Middle Ages applies only to Europe. Because for other parts of the world, you have a different timeline of history and different time periods, and you cannot apply European concepts to other places in the world. You go to other places, you have other terminology, because evolution in human history did not occur in a similar pattern. Everybody has a different way of going through history. If I pull out, the timelines of history for China or for Japan, they're going to look very different to the European one, because sometimes, we have dynasties that determine certain periods, or there's a specific civil war, for example. Or in Japan, when the capital is moved from one city to another. So we have, for example, the Nara period when the capital was in Nara. Or, for example, when the capital was in Edo, so modern-day Tokyo. And you also have, like in China, when there's a certain emperor that takes power, that's when a new period begins, etc. You see different reasons for these periodization that are not the same justifications as the one in Europe. Because although in the grand scheme of things, yes, all history is global, is connected, but you can't apply European concepts on other countries. I'll give you just one example to show you how there isn't universal steps in human history, right? Of these steps, you have to go through these steps in order to see the timeline and evolution of human history. And that is that in most Western countries, you learn about prehistory and the different steps of evolution of humanity. And you learn about how we started off as nomadic people that were hunter-gatherers. And then we started to do agriculture and we settled. So we started becoming nomadic. And because we had this abundance of food, we then started to have pottery to store that food. And it has to be those steps. And there's a pattern that, we can see in the Middle East, and that evolves into modern day Europe. And you can see that pattern there. And so we might think, this must have happened in every single continent, which is not the case, because if you look at Japan, for example, the appearance of pottery predates even agriculture. The process that we saw in Mesopotamia first and then Europe of agriculture, pottery is reversed in Japan. So you don't have this sort of logical steps. I really hope that you can understand that when I talk about the Middle Ages, I'm talking about Europe, medieval Europe, and to some degree, if you want, you can include like North Africa and, you know, the Middle East, like currently Palestine and all of that, because they are involved. But again, it's a European perspective on history. Don't apply. I hate it when people talk about like medieval Japan. It's like, medieval Japan, what do you mean by medieval Japan? It's so different. Like if you put that 1,000 years of European history and place it on like Japanese history, it doesn't make any sense at all. So yeah, hopefully after this video of me rambling on about when did the Middle Ages begin and end, you end up with an answer of, I'm not going to tell you what year it began and end, but I can tell you the vibes of the Middle Ages. And yeah, hopefully it was interesting enough, and see you in my next video, which I promise this one's going to be not a boring one. It's going to be like an interesting one. So take care, guys.